Here, Mom, $15 should cover it. You'll find someplace cheap. Daniel pressed the crumpled bill into my palm like he was tipping a waitress, my own son. Standing in the kitchen, I helped him buy. Looked at me as if I were a tenant overstaying my welcome. If you've ever had family vanish you like that, would you fight back or walk away? The kitchen smelled of burnt toast and stale coffee. Light from the blinds fell in narrow bars across the counter, sharp enough to cut the air. My suitcase leaned against the wall, half zipped as if it had packed itself overnight. I couldn't remember putting the clothes in. Daniel stood by the doorway, arms folded, one foot tapping against the linoleum. We need our own space, Mom. You'll figure something out. The edges of the bill were soft from too many hands. $15. Less than a tank of gas, less than the weekly groceries I used to buy for us both. My chest tightened. I thought about all the years of double shifts, the mortgage payments I made when he was out of work, the nights I sat in this same kitchen sewing curtains while he slept upstairs. None of those words made it past my lips. The screen door groaned as I stepped onto the porch. Damp air carried the scent of wet leaves and wood smoke from somewhere down the street. A truck hissed over rain, slick asphalt in the distance. My boots found the path without looking back. In the driveway, my old Ford pickup waited, rust crawling along the fender, the dent in the tailgate from a winter long gone. The vinyl seat was cold against my back as I slid in, hands resting on the wheel. I stared at the kitchen window, but the curtain never moved. The engine coughed twice before catching. $15 wouldn't take me far, but it would take me far enough. The road out of town was lined with maples burning red and gold against the gray sky. I rolled the window down, letting the wind sting my cheeks. Every mile peeled away a layer of something heavy, leaving a rawness that felt almost clean. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, not yet. But I knew where I wasn't going. Back to that kitchen, back to the thin smile that had sent me off like a stranger. By noon, I'd passed the gas station at the county line. The man at the pump gave me a nod, the kind you give someone you might have seen before but can't quite place. I nodded back, topped off the tank, and counted what was left, $10.23. I stopped at a roadside diner, the kind with chip mugs and pie under a glass dome. The coffee was weak, but it was hot. I ate slowly, watching rain streak the window, thinking about places I could go. Motels were too expensive. Friends, most had moved, some had passed. Others, well, there's a kind of distance that starts long before you leave. The waitress refilled my cup without asking. "Traveling far?" she said. "Just moving on?" I replied. Her smile was polite, not prying. That small mercy was worth more than the coffee. By late afternoon, the clouds pressed low over the hills. The road narrowed, winding through stretches of bare, limbed birch and pine. Somewhere past the next ridge was the lake. I could smell it before I saw it, sharp and clean, like metal and rain. The last time I'd been near Champlain was years ago, before Henry passed, before Daniel stopped calling me just to talk. I didn't have a plan to go back there, but the thought flickered. That cabin, dusty, worn, forgotten, was still standing, maybe. I shook the thought off, one thing at a time. Tonight I needed somewhere dry, somewhere no one could knock on the door and tell me I didn't belong. The wind picked up as dusk settled. I found an empty turnout and pulled over. The air smelled of pine needles crushed under the tires. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and listened to the soft ping of cooling metal under the hood. Sleep wouldn't come easy, but I'd learned that wasn't the point. Rest was rest, even in pieces. When morning came pale and thin, I poured the last of the thermos coffee into a paper cup. The horizon was streaked with the promise of clearer skies. Somewhere out there was the life I'd have to build from what was left. $15, an old truck, and the will to keep driving. I started the engine and turned the wheel toward the lake. Whatever waited there, it would be mine to face on my own terms. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The porch sagged toward the lake, one shutter hanging by a single hinge. Moss had taken the north wall, climbing higher than my head. I set my bag down just inside the door, the air greeting me with a mix of dust, pine and long unopened drawers. The first night I slept in my coat. The wood stove rattled like an old man clearing his throat, and the wind found every crack in the walls. I stacked my boots against the door to keep the cold from crawling in. Morning brought a brittle kind of light. I walked the perimeter, making a list in my head. Roof, steps, that loose shutter, the pump out back. The lake was glassy, stretching out under a sky the color of pewter. I remembered standing here with Henry, tracing clouds and guessing when the rain would hit. That memory came like a knife wrapped in cloth, sharp but softened by time. By the second week, I had found the rhythm. Haul wood patch walls, boil water from the lake until I could get the pump working. My hands cracked and bled, but I wrapped them in cloth and kept going. Each nail I drove was a wordless answer to that $15 goodbye. It wasn't all work. On Saturdays, I drove into town for the market. At first, I just walked the aisles, taking in the chatter and smell of cinnamon bread. Then I started bringing my own, small pies, jars of berry jam. Folks noticed. Tom, who sold maple syrup from his family's trees, offered to help fix the porch if I'd trade him a pie each week. Ivy from the flower stand began stopping by with bread when she came out this way. Little by little, the cabin stopped feeling like a place I was hiding in. It became mine. The roof stopped leaking. The steps held steady. Inside, the shelves were lined with jars and dried herbs. The curtains I stitched from old flannel shirts hanging in the windows. One night in late autumn, I stood on the porch with a mug of tea, watching the moon trail its light over the lake. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves. Somewhere, an owl called, low and certain. My chest felt both full and steady in a way I hadn't known for years. This was a life I built with my own hands. No one had given it to me. No one could take it without a fight. That winter came early. Snow settled on the roof like a thick quilt, muting the wind. The days shortened, but inside the stove glowed red. On the coldest nights, I thought about Daniel, how quiet the phone stayed, how far away a son can feel without changing his address. I told myself I didn't need him here. I almost believed it. By February, the cabin and I had learned each other's moods. The roof groaned under snow but held. The pump ran clear after I replaced the old leather washer. Evenings were for mending, socks, chair legs, my own resolve. The silence stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like a choice. Ivy brought me tulip bulbs one morning, wrapped in newspaper. "Plant them when the ground softens," she said. "You'll want something bright come spring." I tucked them into a jar on the shelf, a promise waiting in the dark. Tom showed up with a bundle of cedar planks, grinning. "Porch'll smell like a forest by the time we're done." We worked side by side, the lake wind carrying our breath in pale clouds. Each kindness stitched me a little tighter into this place. By spring, the path from the cabin to the dock was lined with wild violets. My pies sold out before noon at the market. I even found myself laughing again. Full, unmeasured laughter, when the local kids dared each other to jump from the dock into the still, cold water. Summer brought long days and the hum of dragonflies over the garden. The marigolds kept the beetles off the beans, and the tomatoes blushed early. I canned in batches, the sweet, acid scent filling the kitchen. On market days, I came home with empty jars and a full basket of bread, cheese, and gossip. By the time the leaves began to turn again, I'd stopped counting the months. The cabin felt lighter, as if it, too, had decided I belonged. Then, one afternoon in late September, a shape moved at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was Tom, come to drop off syrup. But the gait was different, slower, uneven. The duffel bag over one shoulder caught the light, and my stomach went cold. Daniel stepped into the clearing, taller than I remembered, but with the same hitch in his walk from an old basketball injury. His hair was shorter, streaked at the temples. He paused when he saw me on the porch like he wasn't sure I'd still be here. "Hi, Mom," he said, setting the bag down in the grass. His smile was small, almost careful. "Mind if we talk?" The air between us felt heavier than the September heat. I saw the scuff on his boots, the fray at his cuffs. City life hadn't been gentle. Still, I kept my voice even. "You found me." He glanced at the cabin, taking in the repaired roof, the painted shutters, the tidy garden. "Looks nice. You've done well for yourself?" I nodded, but didn't move from the top step. The lake behind me caught the light, flashing silver. Somewhere deep in my chest, a knot I thought I'd untied pulled tight again. Daniel picked up his bag and climbed the steps. "I was hoping," he said, "you might let me stay a while." The wind shifted, bringing the scent of wood smoke from the stove inside. I stepped aside to let him pass, but in my mind, the seasons we'd just spent apart replayed. Quiet proof of what I could survive without him. And what I might have to survive with him here. Daniel dropped his bag beside the sofa as though it had always belonged there. The cabin felt smaller with him inside, his presence rearranging the air. He walked a slow circle, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a shelf, the curtain hem. "You've kept busy?" he said, his tone halfway between compliment and inspection. "I have," I replied, moving to the stove. The kettle was still warm from lunch. I poured water into the teapot, the steam rising in thin, curling threads. He leaned against the counter, close enough for me to smell rain in his jacket. Must be nice, not having to do much all day. I set the lid on the pot. There's always something to do here, chopping wood, keeping the roof sound, the garden. He smiled faintly, eyes on the ceiling beams. Wes, it's different when you don't have anyone to take care of anymore. The words slid in under my ribs. I kept my face still. I take care of myself. That's not what I meant, he said quickly, though his smirk lingered. Just, when people stop needing you, it's a different kind of life. Outside, the lake wind rattled the shutters. I remembered a boy chasing fireflies barefoot across this floor, hands cupped to keep the light from escaping. That boy was nowhere in the man standing here now. Daniel settled into a chair, stretching his legs as if testing the room's boundaries. I was thinking, he began, maybe this place is too much for you. Winters can be rough. You could fall. Nobody would know for days. I've managed 2 winters here, I said, and both times I came out fine. He shrugged. I'm just saying, wouldn't it be better to live closer to town? Safer, warmer, easier. I poured tea into 2 mugs and set one in front of him. And what would happen to the cabin? He traced a ring in the wood with his finger. It's still family, isn't it? I could keep an eye on it. Make sure it doesn't fall apart. The implication sat between us, heavy as the steam curling from our cups. I heard the faint creak of the dock in the shifting wind, the whisper of water against the shore. This place has stood for years without your watch, I said. It'll stand longer still. He gave a short laugh. You don't have to make it sound like I abandoned you. You left? I met his eyes. I left because you told me to. $15, remember? The smile faltered. He looked away, drumming his fingers on the mug. That was a bad time. I wasn't thinking straight. Maybe not, I said. But you were thinking something. Silence spread out, edged by the kettle's soft tick as it cooled. I watched him, the slope of his shoulders, the way he avoided my gaze. The years apart had changed his face, but not the way he tested ground before stepping onto it. Somewhere in that moment, I understood his being here wasn't just about a place to sleep. It was about the cabin itself. And if he was testing ground, I needed to be ready for the next step. Daniel's gaze roamed the room again, lingering on the framed photograph of Henry by the dock. Dad would have wanted you to be comfortable, he said. Not stuck out here? I am comfortable, I replied. My voice even. He lifted a brow. Sure, for now. But this place is old, Mom. It'll get harder. You don't have to prove anything. I took a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth sit on my tongue before swallowing. I'm not proving anything. I'm living my life. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Maybe I could take some of the load off your shoulders. Handle the bills. The upkeep. You could move somewhere smaller. Cozier? I heard the subtext. Control dressed up as help. The upkeep is mine to handle, I said. The bills too. His smile thinned. You've always been stubborn? I set my mug down, the ceramic clicking softly against the table. I've always been capable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of wet pine through the open window. The curtain lifted and fell like a slow breath. Daniel broke the silence. I'm not trying to push you out. I'm just thinking about the future. Whose future? I asked. He blinked as if the question caught him off guard. Ours. Family. I almost laughed. Family doesn't hand you $15 and tell you to go. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away this time. I regret that. The words landed without weight. Regret without change is just a story you tell yourself to sleep at night. I stood and walked to the sink, rinsing my cup. The water ran cold, splashing against the porcelain. Behind me, his chair scraped as he stood. Look, he said, things have been rough for me too. I lost the house. The bank took it. I've been staying with a friend, but that's not forever. I dried my hands on a towel, still facing the window. So you came here? It's the only place that feels, he trailed off, searching for the word. Solid. The admission hung in the air, honest in a way that made me ache. But I also knew. Solid ground can be claimed if you're not careful. I turned to face him. You're welcome to stay a little while, but the cabin is my home. That won't change. He studied me, weighing the boundaries in my voice. We'll see, he said finally, almost under his breath. The rest of the evening passed in polite fragments. Dinner, dishes, the lamp's soft glow pooling on the table. Outside, The lake shifted under the moon, restless and silver. When I went to bed, I lay awake longer than I wanted to, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of another person moving in my space. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, I measured against the thought that had been forming all day. Daniel wasn't here to visit. He was here to stay. And if he stayed, I needed to decide how far I was willing to go to keep what was mine. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee that wasn't mine. Strong, burnt, and too bitter. Daniel's way. He was already at the table, a stack of envelopes spread before him. "Morning," he said, like this was any other day in our lives. "I brought your mail in. You've got some things you might have missed." I glanced at the envelopes. Utility bills, a property tax notice, a glossy pamphlet from the bank. My stomach tightened. He tapped the tax notice. "You know this went up again, right? Vermont property taxes are no joke. And with the cost of heating oil this winter," he shook his head, whistling low. "I'm aware," I said, moving to the counter to put on the kettle. "You don't have to carry this alone, Mom." His tone was smooth, almost gentle. "I could take over the taxes for you. Keep everything in order." I measured tea leaves into the pot, letting the faint scent of chamomile rise. "And how would that work?" "Well," he slid the glossy pamphlet closer. "Would transfer ownership. Just on paper. That way I'd be the one dealing with the bills, the repairs, all the headaches. You could just enjoy the place without worrying." I kept my eyes on the swirling leaves in the hot water. "Ownership doesn't come without control, Daniel." "It's still family," he said quickly. "It's not like I'd sell it out from under you." I turned, leaning against the counter. $15. 2 years ago. That's what you thought I was worth." His jaw tightened. "Why do you keep bringing that up?" "Because it's part of the story," I said, "and I'm not rewriting it." He exhaled through his nose a short huff. "Look, I made mistakes. I'm trying to fix them. I don't want to see you struggling when there's an easier way." I set 2 mugs on the table, the ceramic thudding softly against the wood. "Easier for who?" His smile was thin. "For both of us." We drank in silence for a while, the only sound the faint tick of the stove cooling. Outside, the lake shimmered under a sky the color of pewter. A loon's call carried across the water, long, low, mournful. Finally, he pushed the pamphlet toward me again. "Just read it." "No pressure. I didn't touch it." "You've been here 2 days and already you're talking about paperwork?" "I'm thinking ahead," he said. I met his gaze. "So am I." For a moment, we stayed like that, his hand resting on the pamphlet, my fingers curled loosely around my mug. It was the same kind of standoff we'd had when he was 15, refusing to apologize for breaking a neighbor's fence. Back then, I'd waited him out until he fixed it himself. I wondered how long I'd have to wait this time. Daniel broke the stare first, leaning back in his chair. "Fine, no rush. But we should be realistic. Winters here aren't getting easier. And I'm not going anywhere." That last sentence was less an observation than a declaration. My pulse slowed, steadying in the way it does before a decision. The lake breeze slipped through the open window, cool against my skin, carrying the scent of wet pine and wood smoke. I sipped my tea, letting the silence grow. If Daniel thought he could wait me out, he didn't yet understand the difference between endurance and surrender. He would. That afternoon, Daniel offered to help stack firewood. I let him, curious to see how long he'd last. 10 minutes in, he leaned on the handle of the wheelbarrow, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You've got a lot of work here for one person," he said, glancing toward the cabin. "Imagine if something happened to you in the middle of winter." I bent to pick up another log. "If something happens, I'll deal with it." He shook his head, smiling in that way people do when they think they're being reasonable. "That's pride talking. I'm talking about safety." "Safety?" I said. "Has nothing to do with signing over my home." His smile faltered. "It's just practical, Mom." We carried wood in silence for a while, the clunk of logs on the stack filling the air. The lake was a sheet of silver beyond the trees, the sky beginning to dim toward evening. My arms ached, but I wasn't about to show it. Inside, Daniel started dinner, chili from a can stirred half-heartedly on the stove. "You know," he said, "we could sell this place for a good price. You could have a comfortable apartment in town. No more hauling firewood, no more worrying about repairs." I ladled the chili into bowls. "This place isn't for sale." He pushed his bowl aside. "You've got to stop thinking like you're 25. I'm thinking like someone who knows what's hers," I said. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Do you even realize how much easier life could be if you just let me handle things? You could travel, visit friends, no responsibilities. This place is my responsibility, I replied, and my choice of the air between us tightened. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a folded document, crisp and new. He smoothed it out on the table between us. I talked to a friend at the county office, he said. This is a draft of the transfer paperwork. You wouldn't have to do a thing. Just sign here. He tapped the line. Aren't it handled? I didn't even look at the paper. Put it away, Daniel. He didn't move. I'm trying to help you? No. I said, my voice low but steady. You're trying to help yourself. His mouth pressed into a hard line. You think the world's gonna get easier? You think this cabin is gonna take care of you when you're 80? I stood, gathering the empty bowls. I take care of the cabin. It takes care of me. That's how it works. He stayed seated, his hand resting on the document like he could will me into reaching for it. When I didn't, he finally crumpled it slightly, shoving it back into his pocket. Fine, he said. But don't say I didn't warn you. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose shutter against the siding. The sound was sharp, rhythmic like a reminder. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the treetops sway, and thought of the cedar box under my bed. The deed, Henry's careful handwriting, the letter from the bank. Daniel didn't know I had proof. He didn't know I was already thinking ahead. By the time I went to bed, I'd decided on 2 things: I would protect the cabin at any cost, and Daniel would never see me hesitate again. He could stack his papers as high as he wanted. I was already building something stronger. The next morning, Daniel was already in the kitchen when I woke. The coffee smelled burned, the way it does when someone boils it too long. He was on the phone, voice low but clipped. I told you, she won't sign yet. No, I'll handle it. He saw me and ended the call quickly. Morning, he said too brightly. I made coffee. I poured a cup, ignoring the bitterness on my tongue. Who was that? Just a friend, he said, looking past me toward the window. You should probably take it easy today. I can run into town for supplies. I shook my head. I've got to get to the market. Ivy saved me a basket of pears. He leaned against the counter. You don't have to go every week. People will manage without your pies for a while. That's not the point, I said. It's part of my routine. He smiled in that patronizing way I'd seen on him before. Routines can change. Besides, I'll get what you need. I didn't argue. There was no point in pushing when I could just drive myself later. But when I reached for my keys by the door, they were gone. I glanced at him. Oh, I put them in a safe place, he said. Truck needs a check before you're driving around. I've been driving it fine for years, I said. Doesn't hurt to be careful, he replied, sipping his coffee like it was the end of the discussion. The day dragged. I baked to fill the silence, the smell of cinnamon and apples softening the edges of my frustration. Around noon, I walked down to the mailbox. The air was sharp with the scent of pine. The lake rippled under a pale sun. Halfway down the road, I spotted Ivy's old blue pickup coming toward me. She slowed and rolled down the window. Haven't seen you at the market, she said. Everything all right? Just busy, I said, glancing back toward the cabin. Daniel was on the porch, watching us. Ivy leaned a little closer. Well, if you need anything, I'm just a call away. I nodded, feeling the weight of her gaze, steady and knowing. Back at the cabin, Daniel was suddenly full of questions. Who was that? Ivy, I said. She brought bread last week. He shrugged. You don't need people dropping by unannounced. It's not safe. Safe. I repeated the word, tasting like metal. She's a friend. His expression shifted, soft smile, but the eyes stayed cold. Friends are fine, Mom. Just remember, not everyone has your best interests at heart. The irony made me almost laugh. That night, he turned the radio up while I tried to read, filling the room with chatter from some sports station. I closed the book and went to my room, the sound trailing me through the thin walls. Lying in bed, I realized what he was doing. He was pulling threads, keeping me from town, planting doubt about neighbors, filling the space so there was no quiet to think. It was a slow tightening, the kind that doesn't leave marks. But I've lived through winters here. I know how to survive when things close in. I kept my head down, listened, waited. In the dark, I thought about Ivy's steady eyes on the road. That might be my one open door. 2 days later, Daniel announced he'd be handling errands. From now on, No need for you to waste gas, he said like I was some fragile guest instead of the owner of the keys he'd taken. I didn't answer. Let him think I was nodding along. Meanwhile, I began keeping a small list tucked inside my recipe book, things I needed from town, but not the kind he'd notice. Thread, a new latch for the cellar, a tin of strong tea Ivy always stocked. On Thursday, I spotted Ivy's blue truck again. She slowed, same as before. Your truck's not in town anymore, she said. Tom mentioned you haven't been selling pies. Daniel's been helping? I replied carefully. Over her shoulder, I saw the shape of Daniel standing at the cabin window. But I could use some flour. Think you could bring some by tomorrow? Her mouth curved into a slow smile. Of course! That night, Daniel made stew, thick with salt. You shouldn't have to cook all the time, he said, watching me taste it. I've got things covered. Covered. That was his word for pushing me into the background. I stirred the stew and thought about Ivy's smile, how it didn't need explanation. The next morning, Daniel announced he'd be gone all day, meeting a friend about some business. I waited until his truck rolled out of sight, then pulled on my boots. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, the smell of frost sharp in my nose. Ivy arrived not 20 minutes later, flour in hand. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, eyes flicking over the room. You all right? She asked. I'm fine, I said, but my voice didn't convince either of us. I told her about the keys, the market, the constant watchfulness. I didn't tell her about the letter in the cedar box. Not yet. She set the flour on the counter. You need a second set of keys? She said. And you need to keep going to the market. Folks are asking. I don't have a second set, I admitted. She grinned. You will. From her coat pocket, she pulled a folded paper bag. Inside was a small metal blank. Tom can cut you one. No questions. The weight of that little blank in my hand was heavier than it looked. By afternoon, I'd tucked it into the lining of my coat. Daniel came back later than usual, his jacket smelling faintly of cigars. A scent I hadn't known him to like. He didn't ask about my day. I didn't tell him. Instead, I baked toupees, one for the cabin, one to trade. The smell of apples and cinnamon filled the air, making the room feel like mine again. Even with him in it, he complimented the crust. But his eyes stayed fixed on the pie cooling by the window. That night, while he was in the shower, I stepped out to the porch. The lake was still, the moon casting a silver path toward the far shore. I thought about the blank key, about Ivy's truck waiting just down the road on market days, about the fact that no matter how many threads Daniel tried to pull, some knots don't come loose. Inside, the water stopped running. I slipped the key back into my coat pocket and closed the door softly. If he wanted to keep me penned in, he'd soon find the gate had more than one latch. It was Ivy who told me about the harvest supper at the Grange Hall. Half the county will be there, she said, sliding a flyer across my market table. Live music, pies, raffle. You should come. I hesitated. It had been years since I'd stood in a crowded hall without feeling like I'd wandered in uninvited. But Ivy's eyes held that steady insistence that left no room for retreat. All right, I said. If you'll save me a seat? When I mentioned it to Daniel over supper, he smirked. What would you even do there? Sit with the old-timers and talk about knitting? He stirred his stew lazily. Maybe I should come along, keep an eye on things. Something in his tone tightened the air. It's a community supper, Daniel, I said evenly. Anyone can go. The night of the supper, the air was crisp enough to turn breath into smoke. I wore my deep green wool coat, the one Henry bought me for our 25th anniversary, and a scarf Ivy had knitted in Lake, water blue. Daniel drove, saying he didn't want me, fumbling in the dark on back roads. The Grange Hall glowed warm against the cold, strings of golden bulbs draped across the porch. Inside, the scent of roasted turkey, yeast rolls, and pumpkin pie wrapped around me like a quilt. People called my name, market friends, neighbors I hadn't seen since the snow melted. For a moment, I forgot Daniel was beside me. We sat at a long table draped in gingham. Ivy waved from the end, but before I could stand, Daniel leaned close. Let's stay here. I don't feel like shouting over the noise. I stayed seated, but my eyes kept finding the corner where Ivy was talking with Tom, their heads bent in easy conversation. Halfway through the meal, the MC, a round-faced man in suspenders, tapped the microphone. We've got some new folks here tonight. Let's welcome them properly. He nodded toward our table. Daniel and his mother, Marjorie. Polite applause rose, and I smiled, giving a small wave. But Daniel stood, resting his hand on my shoulder like he was presenting a prize. "Thanks," he said, loud enough to carry. "I've just moved in with Mom to help her out. She's been struggling to keep up with the cabin. You know how it is at her age." The words hit me like ice water poured down my back. Conversations nearby paused. A few sympathetic glances slid my way. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Daniel chuckled. "We're figuring it out, though. She's lucky to have family close by. Lucky." I thought of the letter in the cedar box, of the blank key sewn into my coat lining. I felt Ivy's gaze from across the room, sharp as a spark. Tom's brows drew together, his jaw setting. But Daniel had already sat down, reaching for his coffee like he'd just given a speech worth framing. I took a slow breath, letting the smell of strong brew and cinnamon rolls steady me. "Excuse me?" I said, standing. My chair scraped lightly against the wooden floor. At the dessert table, Ivy slid a plate toward me without asking. "You all right?" she murmured. "Better than I look," I replied. She leaned in, her voice low. "He's trying to write your story for you. Don't let him." I smiled faintly, lifting my fork. I wasn't planning on it. When I returned to the table, Daniel was laughing with the man beside him, retelling the story of how I nearly set the stove on fire, my first winter here. I let the sound wash past me, focusing on the fork in my hand, the pie's buttery crust flaking under pressure. If humiliation was his game, I'd let him think I was still on the board. But my next move would be mine alone. The music struck up, a fiddle's bright run over a steady guitar. I tapped my foot lightly, keeping time, and waited for the moment the crowd would turn its eyes elsewhere. The band eased into a slower tune, and people began drifting toward the edges of the room, carrying plates of pie and mugs of cider. Daniel excused himself to network with a cluster of men near the raffle table. I stayed seated, content to watch the room hum with life. But when the raffle began, Daniel reappeared, one hand in his pocket, the other guiding the MC toward our table. "You should tell them about the property, Mom," he said brightly, as if we were sharing a pleasant family anecdote. The MC chuckled, passing the mic. "Oh, what's this?" Daniel leaned in, voice carrying across the hall. "She's sitting on this gorgeous lakeside cabin all by herself. Too much for her to handle, really. We've been talking about moving her into town, closer to services. You know, before winter gets the better of her." A ripple moved through the crowd, sympathy from some, curiosity from others. My face stayed neutral, but my pulse thudded in my ears. "That's not exactly the conversation we've had," I said evenly, keeping my eyes on the MC. Daniel laughed, a practice sound meant to smooth over discomfort. "She's modest, always downplaying things. But we'll make sure she's taken care of." The words, "taken care of," landed heavy like chains wrapped in silk. Across the room, Ivy shook her head slowly. Tom, beside her, crossed his arms. I set my fork down and rose, drawing the smallest pause from the crowd. "Since we're sharing," I said, my voice clear, "I should mention that the cabin's been standing just fine under my care. 2 years without a leak or a tax bill unpaid." A murmur rolled through the hall. Daniel's smile tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I continued, "And I'm grateful for the friends who've stopped by to lend a hand. Not because I'm incapable, but because community is about showing up for each other." Someone at the back clapped once, tentative but real. I met Ivy's eyes, her nod was barely perceptible. The MC, sensing tension, shifted the raffle along. Daniel sank into his chair, muttering, "That wasn't necessary." "Neither was rewriting my life for an audience," I replied. The rest of the supper passed in a blur of music and polite chatter. But when it came time to leave, Daniel insisted on driving. "Roads'll be slick," he said, already taking my coat from the peg. Outside, the night was sharp and clear, the stars like frost scattered across black glass. The cold bit my cheeks, but I welcomed it. It kept me focused. Halfway down the gravel road, Daniel broke the silence. "You made me look bad in there." "You didn't need my help for that," I said. His hands tightened on the wheel. "I'm trying to make things easier for you. Be deciding for me. By planting ideas in other people's heads about what I can or can't do." He exhaled sharply, but didn't answer. When we reached the cabin, he went straight to the pull-out sofa, muttering something about an early start tomorrow. I stood in the kitchen, coat still on, listening to the soft crackle of the wood stove. That's when I noticed the folded slip of paper by the bread box. My name was written on it in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. I opened it carefully. "Marjorie, saw the look on your face tonight. If you ever need someone to witness or vouch for you, I'm here." "Tom," The paper smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar. I slid it into my pocket, my mind already mapping how and when I might need such a thing. In the living room, Daniel was already snoring, his shape outlined against the dim orange light. I watched him for a long moment, weighing the cost of letting him believe he was still ahead. Let him think I was cornered. Let him think the crowd's sympathy tonight had softened me. The truth was simpler tonight had given me an ally, and that was the first piece I needed. Outside, the lake murmured against the shore, each wave like a quiet agreement. Winter would come soon enough, but I was already building my defense. Morning came pale and cold, the kind that makes the lake look like steel. I woke before Daniel, his snores drifting from the living room like the low growl of some hibernating animal. The note from Tom was still in my coat pocket, its edges worn soft from the number of times I'd unfolded it in the dark. I moved quietly, the way you do when you've lived with someone you can't fully trust. The cedar box under my bed slid out with a familiar scrape against the floorboards. Inside, the papers were just as I'd left them, except one envelope near the top had been turned upside down. It was from Champlain Savings and Loan, dated 3 months ago. My name printed neatly on the front, but the return address wasn't mine. I'd read it once before in the dead of night, but in the gray morning light, the words struck harder, a confirmation of a request to change the primary contact and mailing address for the property tax account tied to this cabin. Denied pending verification. I hadn't filed such a request. The kettle began to hum on the stove. I tucked the letter back into the envelope, but this time I slid it into the bottom of my knitting basket instead of the box. If Daniel went snooping again, I wanted him to think everything was where it had always been. By the time he shuffled into the kitchen, I was pouring tea into 2 mugs. His hair was mussed. His smile the lazy kind he used to get away with as a teenager. "Morning, Mom. Morning," I said, sliding the mug across the table. He sat, rubbing his hands together, thinking of heading into town today. Need to see about a couple of things. I stirred honey into my tea, the spoon tapping slow against the ceramic. "I might come with you. Haven't been to the market in a while?" His eyes flicked up, then away. "Actually, I was going to make it quick. No need for you to bundle up and—" "I'll be fine," I said, not raising my voice but not leaving room for argument. "In town." I let him drift toward the hardware store while I walked to the bank. The brass door handle was cold under my fingers, the lobby warm and faintly scented with floor polish. A woman in her 60s, name tag reading Elaney, greeted me with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Blake, how can I help you today?" I placed the letter on the counter. "I need to know who tried to change the contact information on my property account." Her smile faded. "One moment, please." She returned with a folder, flipping through papers until she found the form in question. "Request came in by mail," she said. "Signature matches the one we have on file, but the return address is different." I looked at the photocopy. The address belonged to a post office box in town, the same one Daniel used when he was selling fishing gear online a few years back. "Can you tell me if anyone came in person to follow up?" I asked. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "A man mid-40s tall, dark hair. Said he was your son." I thanked her, sliding the letter back into my bag. Outside, the winter air slapped my cheeks, but the cold felt clarifying. At the market, I bought a jar of local honey and a loaf of rye bread I didn't need, just to keep my hands busy. Daniel was waiting by the truck, a brown bag of screws and sandpaper under his arm. "Get what you needed?" he asked. "More than you know," I said, climbing into the passenger seat. The drive back was quiet. Snow flurries began to fall, catching in the bare branches. In my mind, I was already setting pieces into place, copies of the deed, Tom's note, Elaine's confirmation. If Daniel thought I'd walk into his plan blind, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The snow thickened by afternoon, laying a thin lace over the lake and the cabin's roof. Daniel busied himself in the shed, the clang of tools carrying through the cold air. I watched from the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone lukewarm. On the counter sat 3 envelopes, the deed, Tom's note, and the bank letter. I'd slid them inside a plain manila folder, sealing the flap with a strip of masking tape. It looked unremarkable, the kind of thing you might toss into a drawer and forget. That was the point. When Daniel came in, brushing snow from his jacket, I was at the table with my knitting, working on the porch steps. He said, his tone casual. "Figured I'd fix them up before they get too bad." I nodded. "That's thoughtful." His eyes darted to the folder on the counter. What's that? Recipes? I said, not missing a stitch. Thinking of baking for the market this weekend. He grinned faintly and headed for the bathroom. The moment the door clicked shut, I slipped the folder into the false bottom of the flour tin Henry had built years ago. It sat on the highest shelf in the pantry, out of easy reach, and unless you knew to lift the tin just right, you'd never notice the extra space. That evening, I walked to Ivy's place under the cover of early darkness. The snow muffled my steps, the cold biting at my nose. Her porch light spilled a warm pool over the path, and the smell of her wood stove met me halfway. Inside, she handed me a quilt for my shoulders before I'd even sat down. "You look like you've got something on your mind," she said. I told her, briefly, about the bank letter, the post office box, Elaine's confirmation. Her brows drew together. "You think he's trying to take the cabin?" "I know he is," I said, "and I'm not giving him the chance." She poured 2 cups of tea, the steam curling between us. "What do you need from me?" "2 things. A safe place to keep some papers, and someone I trust to witness a signature." Her answer came without hesitation. "Doan?" By the next morning, the folder was in her cedar chest, tucked under a pile of winter scarves. I felt lighter walking back, even with the cold nipping at my ears. Daniel was at the kitchen table when I returned, leafing through a stack of old fishing magazines. "Thought you were sleeping in?" he said. "Early errands?" I replied, hanging up my coat. He studied me for a moment, then let it drop. "I was thinking, maybe I could help you get the place appraised. Just to see what it's worth." I stirred the fire in the wood stove, letting the sparks leap. "I already know what it's worth to me?" He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sentimental value doesn't pay taxes." "Neither does greed," I said, and left it at that. The next few days I kept my movements steady and ordinary, baking bread, shoveling snow, mending a torn curtain. But underneath I was building a trail. Receipts for repairs I'd paid for, photos of the garden and the cabin in all seasons, and notes about the work I'd done since moving back. Proof of care, proof of ownership, proof that this was more than just a piece of land to me. One evening, as we ate supper in the quiet, Daniel mentioned that he might drive into town again soon. "Need to check my mail," he said. I smiled across the table. "At the post office." His fork paused mid-air, just for a second. "Yeah." I let the moment stretch, then went back to my stew. I didn't need to push. Not yet. The snow outside caught the lamplight, turning the night into a soft glow. I thought of the folder in Ivy's chest, safe and waiting. I thought of the bank clerk's voice, low and certain. "He said he was your son." He was still my son. But that didn't mean I'd let him take what wasn't his. And if he thought I was just knitting by the fire, he had no idea how close I was to pulling the first thread. Sleep had been thin for days. I would close my eyes, but the moment the cabin sank into silence, my mind would start moving, circling Daniel's words, the bank letter, the post office box. By the 3rd night, I stopped trying to fight it. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, the lamplight spilling over the cedar box, the empty mug beside it. Outside, the lake lay dark and still, a mirror for the winter sky. The moonlight caught the ice forming along the shore, tracing pale lines like cracks in glass. I thought of Henry then. How he used to say that water tells you more than people do. If you're willing to watch. He'd been right. It was his voice I heard as I shuffled through the papers, looking for a specific envelope, the one with his handwriting and the note he'd left me before his last fishing trip. I hadn't opened it in years, but tonight it felt necessary. The paper crackled softly. "If you're reading this, something's changed." That was the first line. His words were steady, practical, without flourish. "This cabin is yours. Not because of the work you've done or the years we've spent here, but because you understand what it means to hold a place, not just own it." I read the letter twice, letting the weight of it settle. Henry had known I might face a day when I'd have to defend the cabin. He'd even written down the steps to take, which lawyer to call, where to find the extra savings account, which neighbors to trust. Every detail was clear. The clock above the stove ticked into the small hours. The fire had died down to embers, glowing faintly in the grate. I made a list, just as Henry had taught me, simple, numbered, unshakable. 1. Gather proof of ownership and care. 2. Secure documents off-site. 3. Identify allies. 4. Set a timeline. Quiet, firm. I already had the proof and the safe storage with Ivy. Allies. I thought of Tom, who'd helped me fix the porch steps last spring, of Elaine at the bank, and maybe even the clerk at the post office, who had seemed unsettled when I'd asked about the box. The timeline was the hardest part. Too soon, and Daniel might sense the shift. Too late, and he could make another move before I was ready. A floorboard creaked in the living room. I froze, listening. Daniel's footsteps moved toward the kitchen, slow and uneven, like someone half awake. He appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "You're up late," he mumbled. "Couldn't sleep," I said, folding the letter and sliding it into my sweater pocket. He glanced at the table at the scattered papers but didn't press. "Don't stay up too long," he muttered, turning back toward the sofa bed. When he was gone, I sat in the quiet again, pulse steady. If he had seen the papers, he hadn't shown it. But his presence in the doorway told me one thing: I'd have to be even more careful. The nights were no longer just mine. By dawn, I'd made another decision. That afternoon, while Daniel was in town, I would start the second step of the plan, one Henry hadn't listed, but I knew he'd approve of, making it impossible for anyone to move this cabin out from under me without going through a wall of locked doors. The lake caught the first light as I stood by the window. My breath fogged the glass, blurring the horizon for a moment before it cleared. I thought of Henry's last line in the letter. "When you stand your ground, do it quietly, but make sure they feel it." It was time to start. Daniel left just after lunch, saying he needed to check in with a friend in town. His duffel stayed by the sofa, which told me two things: he planned to be back, and he didn't want to risk me moving his things. That was fine. I had work to do. I waited until his truck's rumble faded down the dirt road before pulling the cedar box from under the bed again. The deed, the bank letter, Henry's note, they went into a canvas tote. I added the folder of receipts from repairs, tax payment slips, and a photo album showing the work I'd done on the cabin over the past 2 years. Proof not just of ownership, but of stewardship. Outside, the air was crisp and carried the faint smell of wood smoke from the other side of the lake. I locked the door behind me and headed for Ivy's place. Her house was a 10-minute walk along the shoreline path, the same one we'd used for berry picking in summer. She opened the door before I knocked. "Thought you might be coming by," she said, stepping aside. "You've got that look." I set the tote on her kitchen table. "I need these kept safe. Somewhere Daniel won't think to look." She didn't ask questions, just nodded and slid the tote into a pantry cupboard. "They're fine here?" From Ivy's, I walked to the post office. The clerk on duty was the same young man who'd handed me my mail the week before. When I asked if anyone had tried to access my P.O. box again, his brow furrowed. "There was a man in here 2 days ago," he said. "Asked if he could have your mail redirected. Said you'd authorized it." He hesitated. "I told him he'd need to bring you in." "Did he leave a name?" He shook his head, but he was driving a dark blue pickup. "Vermont plates?" Daniel's truck was red, but he had friends. That made the knot in my stomach tighten. I left the post office and crossed the street to Champlain Savings and Loan. Elaine, the branch manager, recognized me immediately. When I showed her the letter about the attempted address change, her expression hardened. "I'll flag your account," she said. "Any changes will need you here in person, with ID, no exceptions." By the time I walked back toward the cabin, clouds had gathered low and heavy over the lake. The wind picked up, rattling the dry reeds along the shore. In the distance, I heard the faint growl of an engine. Daniel's truck climbing the hill. Inside, I set the kettle on the stove and moved through the rooms, scanning for anything he might use to claim a stronger tie to the place. No spare keys left out, no old bills in the open. The framed photos of Henry and me stayed, but the newer shots, my market stall, the garden in bloom, went into a drawer. When Daniel came in, he shook the cold from his jacket and smiled like nothing in the world was wrong. "Smells good?" he said, eyeing the kettle. "Tea's almost ready?" I replied, keeping my tone light. I didn't tell him where I'd been or what I'd done. Let him think I'd spent the day here waiting. As we sat at the table, I noticed his gaze flick toward the corner where the cedar box usually rested under the bed. His eyes lingered there a beat too long before returning to me. I sipped my tea slowly, hiding my own glance toward the locked bedroom door. Whatever Daniel had in mind, he'd have to work harder now. And he'd never see the wall I was building until he hit it. Henry's words from that letter came back to me: "Make sure they feel it." But I wasn't ready to strike yet, but I was already setting the stage. Quiet moves made in daylight, invisible until the moment they mattered. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of snow. Change was coming, and I would be ready. The first rule of taking back ground is to move so quietly the other person doesn't realize you've already started. Daniel had been in the cabin for 3 days now, settling in as though the sofa bed was made for him. I made tea, baked bread, and listened. The listening was the important part. By the second morning, I knew his schedule: up late, phone calls outside, a trip to town mid-afternoon. He left his duffel unzipped, papers and receipts spilling out just enough for me to see names and dates. I didn't touch them, yet, but I read plenty from the way he folded, nothing from the numbers scribbled in the margins. Debt, by the look of it. On Thursday, I walked to the market early, basket on my arm, smiling at neighbors as if nothing in my world had changed. Ivy slipped me a folded slip of paper between the bread loaves. "That's my cousin's number," she whispered. "He's an attorney. Not flashy. Knows how to keep things quiet." I tucked it into my pocket without looking. Back home, Daniel was still asleep. I moved through the cabin with purpose, checking the locks, replacing the key on the kitchen hook with a spare that didn't work, and tucking the real keys into the toe of my winter boots. The cedar box stayed at Ivy's. The tote with the deed never came back inside. I started keeping the pantry stocked just enough for me, with extra jars of preserves at Ivy's. If Daniel noticed, he didn't say. He was busy with his phone, stepping outside for long calls, voice low. Once, I caught my name in the murmur followed by, "Paperwork's already done." He turned his back when he saw me watching. That afternoon, I took a walk to the bank, telling Daniel I was meeting Ivy for coffee. Elaine, the branch manager, met me in her office. I handed her a notarized statement, something Ivy's cousin had helped me draft over the phone the night before. It named me as sole owner of the cabin and revoked any prior verbal agreements about cohabitation or shared property. Elaine added it to my file. "Anything else?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "If anyone tries to take out a loan or lien against this property, I want a call." Immediately, walking back, the lake wind stung my cheeks, sharp with the promise of snow. Daniel was on the porch when I returned, leaning against the railing like he owned the view. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe we could split the heating bill this winter. I can handle it. Take some weight off you." "That's generous," I replied, smiling just enough, "but I already paid for the season." His eyes flickered, surprise, then something else. "Paid in full." "In full," I confirmed. I stepped past him into the warmth of the cabin, letting the conversation end there. That evening, while he fiddled with the radio, I wrote a list in the back of my market ledger: utilities, taxes, insurance. One by one I called each company from Ivy's phone, confirming my name and address on every account. I changed passwords, added security questions only I could answer. By the time I returned, the radio was playing static and Daniel was staring at the map of the lake, tracing his finger along the shoreline. "Thinking about going fishing?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just remembering." I left him to it, pouring myself tea and sitting by the fire. The list in my pocket felt like a small shield. Every check mark was another inch of ground he couldn't touch. As the firelight flickered across the walls, I thought of Henry's steady hands tying knots in fishing line. The way he'd say, "You don't have to fight the current. You just have to set the right hook." I was setting mine now, in places Daniel couldn't see. Outside, the wind shifted to the north. The air in the cabin felt cooler, sharper. It was the kind of weather that made the lake change overnight. I wondered if Daniel realized the current had already turned against him. The first real sign he felt the shift came on a Tuesday morning. I was at the sink, rinsing coffee grounds, when he shuffled in, hair a mess. "The internet's out," he said, holding up his phone like it had betrayed him. "It's not out," I replied, drying my hands. I canceled the account. Didn't use it much myself. His brow furrowed. "You canceled it, without telling me. This is my home," I said gently. "I pay for what I need." He stared at me, lips parting as if to argue, then closed them. I watched the calculation flicker in his eyes. He poured himself coffee without another word. That afternoon, I walked into town under the pretense of buying apples. At the post office, I had my mailing address changed to a private P.O. box. The clerk slid me the key, her expression curious but kind. "You moving?" she asked. "No," I said. "Just keeping my mail safer." Back at the cabin, Daniel was sitting at the table with papers spread out, his phone wedged between shoulder and ear. He turned them face down when I came in. "Just sorting some bills," he said. "I'll give you space," I answered, setting the apples on the counter. I didn't need to see the bills. I already knew the direction this was heading. That night, I tucked the P.O. box key into the hollow of the old clock on the mantel, a spot Daniel had never noticed. I slept better than I had in weeks. Over the next few days, I layered my defenses. I moved the garden tools to Ivy's shed. The spare gas cans went to Tom's garage down the road. Anything Daniel might use as leverage, keys, receipts, spare parts, was no longer here. One evening, as snow began to feather the porch rail, he came to me with a smile too wide. "Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe I could help manage things for you. Keep track of your expenses. Make sure you're not overpaying." I closed the book in my lap, marking the page with my finger. "I've managed for 72 years, Daniel. I think I can keep going." His jaw tightened, but he laughed like it was a joke. "I'm just offering. No need to get defensive." "Of course," I said, and went back to my reading. 2 mornings later, Elaine from the bank called my P.O. box number. "Someone's been in here asking about adding their name to your property account," she said. "I thought you'd want to know." I thanked her, my mind already fitting the piece into place. Daniel must have gone into town after his so-called fishing trip yesterday. He'd come back empty-handed, smelling faintly of aftershave and cigarette smoke, not his usual. That afternoon I baked 2 loaves of bread, taking one to Ivy. We sat in her warm kitchen, the scent of cinnamon heavy in the air. "He's pushing," I told her, "but he doesn't see the walls yet." "He will," she said, handing me a fresh mug of tea. "And you'll be ready?" Back home, I found him by the fire, flipping through Henry's old lake map again. He looked up, a shadow of the boy he'd been, and for a moment I almost softened. Almost. "You've been busy," he said. "Always," I replied. He didn't know about the notarized statement at the bank, the P.O. box, the neighbors holding my spare keys. He didn't know that every account had been locked tight, passwords changed, alerts set. He didn't know he was already outside the circle. That night, as the lake whispered under the ice, I sat by the window with my tea, watching the faint glow of his phone light in the next room. He was texting someone, thumbs moving fast, his expression tense. Whatever his plan was, it was already too late. I had anchored mine weeks ago, in paperwork, in quiet conversations, in the steady hands of friends who knew more than they let on. Daniel thought he'd arrived to take over. He didn't see he was the one being managed. The morning of the cutoff came with a sky the color of pewter. I was already dressed, the wood stove humming low, when Daniel shuffled into the kitchen. His hair was damp, like he'd taken extra time to steady himself. "We should go into town today," he said, pouring coffee into one of Henry's old mugs. "Get some paperwork sorted." I folded the dish towel slowly, buying time. "What paperwork?" He glanced at me over the rim of his mug. "Taxes? Utilities. The stuff you've been juggling." The choice of word wasn't lost on me. "Everything's under control," I said. "No trip needed." His smile was tight. "Mom, if you keep putting this off, you're going to regret it." I let the silence hang, the tick of the old clock filling the space between us. "Daniel," I said finally, "the accounts are already taken care of." The confusion flickered first, then suspicion. Taken care of how? I wiped the counter, my movements unhurried. All in my name. Locked. Paid ahead. He set the mug down harder than necessary. "That's not what we talked about." "That's exactly why I did it." For a long moment, he just stared at me, eyes narrowing. "You've been making changes behind my back." "This isn't your back," I said. "It's my home." He pushed away from the table, pacing to the window. Outside, the lake lay still under a thin veil of ice. "You can't just shut me out like this." "I can, and I have." He turned, anger bright under his skin. "I came here to help you." "No," I said, voice low but steady. "You came here to help yourself?" The kettle whistled softly, and I moved to pour tea, the steam rising between us like a curtain. "I've seen the bank letter, Daniel. The one from Champlain Savings." His face drained of color. "You went through my things." "No," I said. "I went through mine." "The letter was addressed to me?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "You're reading this all wrong." "I'm reading it exactly as it's written. Someone tried to change the primary contact for my property account. That someone wasn't me." The fire popped in the stove, sending a small spray of sparks behind the glass. Daniel's gaze shifted there, then back to me. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." "I understand more than you think," I said. "Which is why, as of this morning, you no longer have access to anything here. Keys, accounts, mail." He took a step toward me. "You can't." "I can," I said again, And this time my voice cut through the room like cold wind off the lake. It's already done. The words landed like stones dropped into deep water. The only sound was the slow hiss of the kettle cooling, and somewhere far off, the crack of ice shifting. Daniel didn't sit down. He stood there, breathing through his nose, the weight of what I'd just said settling in. His hands curled into fists, then opened again, empty. Outside, a crow called from the tree line, sharp and final. I met his eyes and didn't look away. Justice wasn't loud. It was just irreversible. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might slam his fist on the table. Instead, he laughed once. A short, bitter sound. So this is it? You're cutting me out like I'm some stranger. I set my cup down, the porcelain making a soft tap on the wood. You made yourself a stranger the day you handed me $15 and told me to find someplace cheap. His eyes flashed. You're still holding on to that? It was years ago. 2 years, I said. 2 winters, 2 springs. Every nail I hammered into this place, every meal I cooked from my own garden, those weren't just chores. They were my answer to you. He paced toward the window again, running his hand through his hair. Outside, the lake was a sheet of dull silver, the ice shifting with a low groan. You're blowing this way out of proportion. I just wanted to make sure the cabin stayed in the family. You mean in your name? I corrected. He turned sharply. If it's in my name, it's still in the family. I shook my head. Ownership isn't a feeling, Daniel. It's a fact. And the fact is, Henry made sure this cabin was mine long before you started thinking about deeds. For the first time, his bravado slipped. Henry never told me that. Henry didn't tell you a lot of things. I said, my voice soft but unyielding, because he knew you weren't ready to hear them. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You don't know the kind of trouble I'm in. The debts. The people who... He cut himself off, pressing his lips together. I know enough to keep my name clear of it, I replied. The tension in the room thickened, pressing against my ribs. I thought of the letter in the cedar box, the crisp paper of the deed, the way Henry's handwriting curved around my name. Those weren't just documents. They were anchors. Daniel's shoulders slumped for half a second before he straightened again. You think you can keep this up forever? What happens when you can't take care of this place anymore? I met his gaze. When that day comes, I'll decide what happens. Not you? The fire in the stove let out a sharp crack, startling him. He glanced toward it, then back at me, measuring something in his mind. You're making a mistake? Maybe, I said. But it'll be my mistake to make. The wind outside rose, rattling the loose shutter. The sound seemed to fill the silence that followed, an uneasy rhythm neither of us tried to break. Finally, Daniel pulled his jacket from the back of the chair. This conversation's not over, he said. Yes, I told him. It is. He held my eyes for another beat, searching for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, he pushed through the door and stepped out into the cold. The screen banged shut behind him, the sound echoing in the still air. Through the window, I watched him stride down the dirt path toward the road, his figure shrinking against the pale backdrop of ice and snow. The lake didn't move, but something in me did. A small, certain shift, like the turning of a key. For the first time in 2 years, the cabin felt wholly mine again. I stood at the window until Daniel's figure vanished into the trees. Only then did I turn away, the quiet of the cabin wrapping around me like a heavy quilt. The fire hissed in the stove, settling into a low, steady burn. I pulled the cedar box from under the bed, set it on the table, and opened it without hesitation. The deed lay on top, Henry's handwriting curling around my name like a signature of trust. Beneath it, the letter from Champlain Savings and Loan, confirmation that someone had tried to change the tax account without my consent. I slid both into a thick manila envelope I had prepared days ago, addressed to my attorney in Burlington. I wrote a short note on top. I proceed with securing sole title and filing fraud report immediately. My hand was steady, my pen strokes sharp. This wasn't a decision made in heat. It had been simmering since the day Daniel stepped onto my porch with that duffel bag. Outside, the lake shifted under the wind, a deep groan carrying across the ice. It sounded like warning and promise at once. I sealed the envelope, pressed the flap down firmly, and placed it beside my coat. It would go out with the first post in the morning. I made myself tea, black, no sugar, and sat back down at the table. My mind turned over the last hour, each word Daniel had said, each look he had given me. He'd come to take, not to visit. He'd left with nothing. But I knew him well enough to know that silence wasn't surrender. The knock came sooner than I expected. 3 short raps followed by a pause. Not Daniel, he never knocked. I opened the door to find Ivy, cheeks red from the cold, holding a basket of bread still steaming under a towel. "Thought you could use this," she said. Her eyes flicked toward the path. Saw Daniel heading toward the main road. Looked like a storm cloud with legs. I smiled faintly. We had words. She stepped inside, setting the basket on the counter. "Good." He needed them. She pulled off her gloves, leaning closer. "He's been asking around town about the cabin." I felt the tightness in my chest return, but I kept my tone even. "Let him ask. He won't get what he came for." Her gaze dropped to the manila envelope. "You're handling it." "I am," I said. Quietly. She nodded once, as if satisfied, then wrapped her scarf back around her neck. "You know where to find me if you need backup?" When she left, the cabin seemed smaller, the air denser. I locked the door, slid the bolt, and returned to the table. The envelope sat where I'd left it, patient and unblinking. Night settled in layers. First the dimming of the lake, then the darkening of the trees, until the windows reflected only the inside of the cabin. I fed the fire one last log and sat watching the flames curl and collapse, thinking of all the winters Henry and I had weathered here. This one would be different. This winter I was not defending memories. I was defending my ground. When I finally lay down, the envelope was on the chair beside my bed, close enough to touch. My fingers brushed its edge before I closed my eyes. Somewhere outside, the wind shifted, and the cabin creaked in reply, as if it understood the choice I had made. By morning, the first step of my plan would be in motion. The envelope was gone by sunrise, handed to the postal clerk in town with a receipt tucked neatly into my wallet. The air outside had the bite of late winter, the kind that sharpens your breath. By the time I returned to the cabin, the lake was shifting under a pale blue sky, its frozen skin cracking in slow, echoing reports. Daniel was in the kitchen when I walked in, hunched over a mug of coffee he hadn't made himself. "Where'd you go?" he asked without looking up. "Post office," I said, hanging my coat by the door. "Had a few things to send." He nodded slowly, eyes still on the mug. "You didn't say anything last night?" "Didn't need to," I replied. The conversation was finished. That got his attention. His gaze snapped up, narrowing. "You think you can just shut me out?" I crossed to the stove, set a kettle on the burner, and struck a match. "I'm not shutting anyone out. I'm protecting what's mine." His laugh was short and humorless. "You've got some nerve, Mom. After everything." "After everything." I cut in. "I've learned to take care of myself. And that's what I'm doing now." Silence stretched between us, filled only by the slow build of the kettle's hiss. I could see him measuring his words, deciding whether to push harder or pull back. His fingers drummed on the table, a rhythm I'd heard from him since he was a boy, always when he was plotting something. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "You can't keep this up forever. It's too much for you." I poured water into my teacup, letting the steam rise between us. "That's not your call." His jaw tightened. "It is if something happens to you." The implication hung in the air like a low ceiling. I took a slow sip of tea, keeping my eyes on him over the rim of the cup. "If something happens to me, there are people I trust to handle it. You're not one of them." The color rose in his cheeks, but he looked away first, muttering something I couldn't catch. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and stalked to the door. The cold light from outside cut across the floor as he paused with his hand on the frame. "You're gonna regret this," he said, and then he was gone. I stood still until the crunch of his boots on the frozen path faded. Then I moved to the window, watching him take the curve toward the main road, shoulders hunched against the wind. My pulse was steady, my breathing even, but there was a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was the weight of knowing I'd crossed a line I couldn't step back from. The rest of the morning passed in a deliberate quiet. I baked bread, swept the floors, and brought in more wood. Each task was a reminder that this cabin was not a burden. It was the life I'd chosen, the life I'd built with my own hands. Outside, the lake's ice continued to break apart, the sound like distant gunfire echoing off the hills. By late afternoon, the sun had slipped low, throwing long shadows through the windows. A soft knock came at the door, 2 quick taps, then a pause. It was Ivy again, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "He's been in town," she said without preamble. "Talking to folks at the cafe, asking about property laws. Said you're not well enough to be out here alone." I felt the corner of my mouth twitch, not quite a smile. He's trying to build a case? She stepped inside, shutting the door against the wind. Then you'd better be ready to answer it. I already am, I said, and the certainty in my voice surprised even me. Ivy stayed for tea, her gloved hands wrapped around the mug like it was a small fire. She listened while I told her about the letter from the bank, the deed Henry left me, and Daniel's not so subtle offers to help with the taxes. Her brows drew tighter with each detail. He's not going to stop just because you've told him no, she said finally. Men like that, family or not, they double down. I nodded. That's why the deed's already filed under my name alone, and why the bank knows not to accept changes without me standing right there. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and we both glanced toward the lake. The ice had broken into jagged sheets that knocked against each other with a hollow chime. Ivy set her mug down. Then it's just a matter of waiting him out. Waiting, I said, and not letting him get 1 inch closer to what he wants. By the time she left, the sky was a quilt of gray and rose, the kind of light that makes every surface seem sharper. I closed the door and turned the lock, listening to the solid click. Daniel hadn't returned. Part of me thought he might cool off and try again tomorrow, armed with a softer voice. Another part of me suspected he was already looking for another angle. At dusk, headlights swept briefly across the window. I stayed still, my hands resting on the counter. The engine idled for a moment, then pulled away. No knock, no voice calling Mom, just the slow fade of tires on wet gravel. Night settled in layers. First the deepening blue beyond the trees, then the heavy quiet that comes when even the lake holds its breath. I built a small fire, the wood catching with a gentle sigh. The cabin's warmth pressed against my back as I stood by the window, watching for movement on the road. Nothing. I slept lightly, waking at the creak of the porch in the early hours. My pulse quickened, but when I looked through the curtain, it was only the wind shifting a loose board. I let the fabric fall back, my fingers brushing the edge of the cedar box under the bed. The deed was there. The letter was there. That was enough to let me drift again. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the door. The paper was folded in half, no envelope, no signature. Just 4 words in Daniel's hand. You'll regret this, Mom. I set it on the table, weighing it down with the salt shaker, and poured myself coffee. Let him think what he wanted. Regret was his language, not mine. By mid-morning, Ivy was back, this time with Tom, the retired carpenter from down the road. They were both smiling in that way neighbors do when they've decided to close ranks. We figured we'd help shore up your porch before the thaw makes it worse, Tom said. And if anyone asks, we'll tell them you've got more company than you know what to do with. I stepped aside to let them in, the smell of fresh sawdust already drifting in from Tom's truck. For the next 2 hours, the sound of hammers and low conversation filled the cabin. Every nail they set was another line in the unspoken message, she's not alone. Daniel came back that afternoon. He stopped at the bottom of the path when he saw Tom on the ladder and Ivy handing up a plank. I was on the porch, wiping my hands on a rag. Thought I'd check in, he said, but his voice carried less weight than before. Looks like you just did, I answered. We're busy here. His eyes shifted to the porch repairs, to Ivy's steady gaze, to Tom's casual nod. He didn't step closer. Instead, he adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and gave a thin smile. Guess I'll be in touch. We watched him turn back down the path. The lake wind caught his jacket, snapping it like a small flag. For the first time since he arrived, his shoulders sloped, not with the lazy confidence he'd carried in, but with something heavier. Resignation, maybe, or the realization that whatever leverage he thought he had was gone. When he disappeared into the trees, I felt the tension in my spine ease. The cabin door closed with a sound I knew well, not just wood on wood, but a promise kept. Spring arrived slow in Vermont, the kind that teased you with one warm afternoon before dropping back into frost. The lake shed its ice in fractured sheets, each one catching the pale sun like broken glass. I stood on the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, breathing in the scent of thawing earth and wet cedar. Daniel hadn't been back. Not a knock on the door, not a note. The silence was its own kind of answer. I knew better than to believe it meant the fight was over. But for now, the air felt lighter. The porch boards Tom replaced were solid under my feet, their grain still bright against the weathered planks. Ivy stopped by most mornings now, sometimes just to drop off fresh eggs or sit for a few minutes before heading into town. Neighbors I'd only waved to before began lingering at the market, asking if I'd have any more of my maple, pecan bread for the weekend. Somehow, without meaning to, I'd built more than a cabin here. I'd built a circle. Inside the setter box still lived under the bed, but I opened it less. The deed, the letter from the bank, those were no longer weights I carried daily. They were just tools ready if I ever needed them. Henry's photographs stayed on the shelf now, their frames catching the late afternoon light. Sometimes I'd pause in the middle of sweeping or kneading dough, letting my eyes rest on his smile. By mid-May, I decided the front yard needed more than patchy grass. Tom lent me his tiller, and Ivy helped plant rows of lavender and echinacea. The scent clung to my gloves for hours after we finished, and every time I caught it, I thought of the summers Henry and I spent trying, and failing, to keep flowers alive in the city. One afternoon, a group of kids from the school came by with their teacher, curious about the old cabin. I showed them the garden, the shelves lined with jars of jam and honey, the worn table where the light fell just right for reading. Their laughter spilled through the rooms like fresh air. Before they left, one of the girls shyly asked if I'd let them come back for a reading day. I said yes without thinking. That night, I found myself sketching plans on the back of an old grocery list. Extra chairs from the shed, blankets for the porch, maybe even a small bookshelf near the window. It was the first time in a long while I was thinking about what could grow here, not just what needed protecting. The lake was calm by evening, the surface holding the last of the pink light. I sat by the open window, listening to the slow lap of water against the rocks. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next blow to fall. I was building something, and it was mine. The first reading day came on a Saturday in early June. The sun was gentle, the air just warm enough to carry the scent of lake water and lavender through the open windows. I set out the mismatched chairs from the shed, draped quilts over the porch rail, and placed a plate of molasses cookies on the table. The old oil lamp Henry once polished sat in the center, unlit but still glowing in the morning light. The children arrived in a tumble of chatter, their sneakers leaving dusty prints on the porch. Ivy brought fresh lemonade, and Tom carried in a stack of secondhand books he'd picked up in town. We spread them out across the table, everything from picture books to dog-eared novels, and let the kids choose. Inside, their voices softened to a murmur as they settled in corners and on cushions. The lake shimmered through the open door, a steady silver backdrop to the turning of pages. I read aloud the way Henry used to, slow, letting the words find their own space in the room. A few of the children leaned against the wall, eyes half closed, the rhythm of the story pulling them under. By midday, the cookies were gone and the porch smelled of sun-warmed wood and citrus from the lemonade. One boy, no more than 9, lingered behind after the others had gone. He traced the carvings on the table and asked, "Did you make these?" I smiled. "My husband did, a long time ago." He believed a home should keep the marks of the people who loved it. The boy nodded like he understood, and I realized, maybe he did. When the last car pulled away, the cabin felt different, as if it had stretched to hold all that laughter and light. The chairs stayed where they were, a quiet invitation for the next time. That evening, I walked down to the lake alone. The water caught the fading sun, turning the ripples to liquid gold. I thought of the first night I returned here with $15 in my pocket, of how small and temporary my claim had felt then. Now, I knew better. This place wasn't just shelter. It was a story I was still writing. I knelt by the edge, let my fingers trail in the cool water, and whispered a thank you to Henry, to the neighbors who had stood beside me, and maybe even to myself, for not walking away when it would have been easier. As I stood, a loon called across the water, its echo folding into the dusk. I turned back toward the cabin, its windows warm with light. Tomorrow, I would bake bread for the market, maybe plant more flowers. Life would go on, not because I had been spared loss, but because I had chosen to grow around it. If you've ever been told you were worth less than you knew in your bones, remember, you get to write the ending? You're not alone. Standing at the cabin's doorway, I looked out over the lake one last time that night. The moon was high, scattering silver across the water, and the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth. 2 years ago, I had arrived here with a crumpled bill in my pocket and a hollow ache in my chest. Tonight, I stood in the same place, but the ache was gone. In its place was a quiet certainty this home, this life, was mine, earned, defended, and nurtured. The people who mattered had found their way here. The ones who didn't, well, their absence no longer hurt. I closed the door softly, the latch clicking into place like a promise kept. Life will test the edges of your worth. Some will measure you in dollars, convenience, or what you can give them. Let them. You don't have to fight in their arena. Build your own, sturdy walls, open doors for the right souls, and a fire that's yours to tend. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the steady heartbeat of a life reclaimed. And healing isn't forgetting. It's living so fully that the old wounds no longer own the story.